Darkcast Network. Come to the dark side of indie podcasts.
Are you tired of hearing about the Ted Bundys and Jeffrey Dahmers on True Crime Podcasts? I thought so. We've got something just for you. I'm Pat.
And I'm Darcy, and we are the hosts of Pod of Terror, a true crime podcast that dives into lesser-known cases from around the world.
Grab a glass of wine and join us every Thursday as we discuss the most vile, despicable human beings on the planet.
It'll be a dark and twisted journey, so don't forget your drink. You're gonna need it.
We're looking forward to seeing you next Thursday.
Hey everyone, welcome to True Crime California. I'm your host Cindy, and I'm glad you're here. Hey guys, welcome back to True Crime California. It is November 1st, and we just had Halloween, and it was super fun. I hope everybody had a really great time. Really weird thing, we just moved back to North Hollywood from Burbank. Hopefully the last time we have to move in a very long time. And we got 0 trick-or-treaters, which is totally wild. Last year we actually ran out of candy because we didn't think our neighbor, or no, 2 years ago when we were, anyway, whatever. We've had various levels of success with trick-or-treaters, and this year we had 0. So now I have 2 giant bags of candy, which, I mean, I'm not super mad about it, but it's not exactly good for me, and it's gonna be gone in like a week. Watch. Anyway, sorry it's been a couple weeks since I've recorded. I think I'm just gonna have to post these when I can, and hopefully it's enough to keep everybody interested. I will say that one of the reasons that this took so long is that for this case that I'm going to cover, I read a whole ass book, which I have actually done before, but this was like a really long book. And in addition to the book, I went on like a really deep dive through articles and things, because what I've noticed is a lot of news articles and podcasts that cover this case, they just do like a really high level version. They don't really go into any of the details. And it's a really twisted, really fucked up case with a lot of really horrible but interesting details. So I wanted to do more of a deep dive, and I think I did. This may end up being 2 parts. We'll find out. But anyway, let's get started. I also want to call out, I got a new microphone. I talked to CJ at Darkcast, and maybe we decided like maybe the problem was the microphone. So we're going to see. This one has like a gain on it, and I swear every time I even like think about like swallowing, it's picking up. So I turned the gain all the way down, and I'm really just hoping that this is going to have better sound for everybody. I know some people are like, I don't want to hear you swallow. I don't want you to hear me swallow. So let me know if this sounds any better. I know I get lots of comments on Spotify because they let you leave comments. I appreciate them. I appreciate all the really positive ones and the ones that let me know what's going on with sound quality and other stuff. So keep it up, please. Let me know how this sounds, but hopefully this is like much better. Anyway, I'm going to do the case of the Wineville Chicken Coop Murders. This is actually an old-timey case. I don't do a lot of old-timey cases. I feel like I've been sticking to like the 70s, 80s, and 90s mostly. But this was a really interesting case and really twisted. So be warned, it's not an easy case. This takes place in Wineville, California, which is actually no longer called Wineville, basically because of this case. It's now called Miraloma, and it's in like the greater Los Angeles area, but they straight up changed the name after this all happened. So this case takes place mostly in 1926 through 1928, so in the mid-1920s, and is one of the most terrible stories of child sexual assault and murder I've ever read. And I wanted to also note that a really interesting like tidbit that I read all over the place about this is that the man perpetrating these horrid crimes was covered like neck to ankles in body hair that was so thick it looked like he was wearing full-length pajamas whenever he was standing naked. Like there are people that have a lot of body hair, but this was like notable. Like there was something, I don't know if we want to say wrong. I mean, there was a lot wrong with this man, potentially also in terms of his hair growth. So that just adds like this extra layer of like horrific, crazy scariness to this already awful tale. So like I said, be warned. This is not a case for the faint of heart. So I'm just gonna jump in. Again, I hope everybody had a happy Halloween, and I'm very sorry about what I'm about to do to you all. On March 10th, 1928, 9-year-old Walter Collins was given 10 cents by his mother, Christine, so he could go see a movie at the local cinema. He lived with his mother in Lincoln Park, which is near downtown Los Angeles, but a little bit on like the Pasadena side. His father, also named Walter, was in prison for robbery and was currently in San Quentin up in the Bay Area. When Walter didn't come home after 5 hours, his mother, Christine, called police to report him missing. Now, normally the next thing I would say is that police don't take this seriously and they bungle everything, and believe me, we will get there, but at first police really did take this very seriously and began a large search for the boy. The reason they took this seriously is because they were already under terrible scrutiny for multiple cases of corruption, because apparently some things never change, so they were very motivated to solve this case and find Walter. They followed up on a ton of leads, including people saying they saw Walter with a, quote, foreign couple, as well as with a single man walking down the street. Unfortunately, all of these leads went nowhere. Walter Sr. suggested from his prison cell that maybe one of his fellow inmates had arranged something to happen to his son in retaliation for his being a prison snitch. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, this lead also went nowhere. Now that they had exhausted all leads, the police were getting desperate, and Christine Collins, Walter's mother, was not letting them off the hook. Christine, who spent pretty much all of her time when she wasn't working looking for her son, was obviously beside herself. They had to keep working and doing her daily life as she was the only one supporting herself and her family. Despite this, she always made time to search for her son, and she kept Walter's name in the news and stayed on the police every day for 5 months. Finally, she received news that her son had been found in a small town in Illinois and would be coming home on a train in just a day or two. This was amazing news. Christine waited at the station for her son to arrive, but when he did, her heart sank. It was not her son. Now, when she told police as much, they weren't super happy with that response. The officer in charge, J.J. Jones, straight up refused to believe her and said to, quote, try the boy out at home for a few days. You know, like a pair of shoes, like if you don't like them, you go ahead and bring them back. Except with some random child while hers is still missing. And to be clear, this wasn't really a suggestion so much as a command. So Christine, feeling helpless and still very much missing her son, did as she was told. But despite feeling like her hands were tied, Christine was nothing if not a determined mother, and she set out to prove that this child was not hers. First, she went to the dentist and got dental records for her actual son, then had this new quote-unquote Walter, whoever he was, get his teeth checked. Obviously, the records did not match. Next, she had several friends and family write out statements saying that this child was most certainly not Walter. She did this over the course of like 2 weeks or so, and from there went back to the police to tell J.J. Jones that she had proof this child was not hers. This motherfucker acted exactly as expected and totally lost his shit, making this about him and his reputation rather than trying to actually do his job. He told Christine he wouldn't be talked to that way, not by a woman at least, and accused her of being hysterical. Now, we could go on about the origins of that word for an hour, but we'll just say that this man was a sexist asshole, which was totally of the time. He then had her locked up in a mental hospital, where she was held as a prisoner for 10 days for being hysterical, for saying that this child, who was not her son, was not her son. And to be clear, the only reason she was released was because the boy finally admitted he was not, in fact, her 10-year-old son, Walter. He was instead a 12-year-old runaway who had been told a few times that he resembled the missing Walter and decided to capitalize on that by posing as him so that he could come to Hollywood and meet his favorite Western movie stars. Unbelievable. Christine Collins went on to sue the police and J.J. Jones specifically and was awarded $10,000 by the court, which was a very large amount of money in those days. Unfortunately, she never saw a dime, and J.J. Jones was, of course, only suspended for, I think, about 4 months before going back to work and life as usual. As for Walter, what actually happened to him? In 1906, Sarah Louise Northcott had just discovered she was pregnant, and she was very unhappy about this. She had just lost her infant son to illness and had, as a result, had sunk into a deep depression. News of a new baby on the way only enraged her, as it felt like some sort of sick joke. When her baby boy, Gordon Stewart Northcott, was born just a few months later in Saskatchewan, Canada, it was all she could do to make sure that the infant didn't also die. She gave him no love, nothing extra, just food and a warm place to sleep. Her husband was away working more often than not, and her older daughter was still young, so her attentions were divided anyway. But beyond that, she felt nearly nothing for this new baby. Now, as a note, a lack of love for babies can actually lead to death and likely creates lifelong mental trauma, which is crazy that can happen to a child so young, but it does. And even knowing this, Sarah Louise did not care. Weirdly, this changed after about a year. They say that losing a child is worse than losing a parent, a sibling, or a close friend, and I both believe that and am happy to take their word for it. Now, often parents will become detached as a way of protecting themselves from the severe trauma of their loss, turning off their brains and sort of just going through the motions. Now, luckily, after a time, most people begin to recover from this, at least, for the most part, like the most severe parts of their emotional trauma, and they can get back to some semblance of a normal life. And this was the case for Sarah Louise, who from now on we're just going to refer to as Louise because apparently that's what she went by. Once she came out of her fog, her son Gordon, who also went by his middle name of Stewart, became the apple of her eye. Now, to be clear, normal can mean a lot of things. For Louise, it meant being a domineering wife and mother with a son who could do no wrong in her eyes and therefore no wrong at all. While she treated both of her children like little royalty, it was really over the top with Stewart, who learned from a young age how to manipulate people to get what he wanted, and also learned that even if he was in the wrong, Mommy would always make it better. As Stewart grew up, it became clear that he was gay, which I don't think his mom cared about, but people in the area, of course, would not like that, so it was kept a secret as best as the family could manage. Stewart's father, George, was so beaten down by his wife that he barely said a word or had any involvement in Stewart's young life. So again, very domineering mother, absent father, little prince, Stewart here. I think we're painting a good picture of what his young life looked like and how he was raised to be. Now, the family lived in British Columbia, Canada. That's where Stewart was born and where he spent most of his young life. Something strange happened, though, and he, his mother, and his father all moved to California after Stewart did, quote, something to upset the neighbors regarding their children in 1924 when Stewart was not yet 18. Now, Stewart's older sister, Winnie, was already out of the house. She was married. She had a couple of kids. So she stayed behind in Canada while the rest of the family went to California. Winnie and Stewart were very close, possibly too close, in fact, which is one of the many rumors kind of swirling around about him that I couldn't confirm or deny, but I did want to mention it because the way that they interact, especially later on, is pretty telling. And both were very similar in their dispositions. Charming but scary, cunning, manipulative, and Winnie, like her mother, was domineering and controlling. So anyway, the family moves to Los Angeles, and shortly thereafter, in 1926, Stewart convinces his parents to buy him a chicken farm. His reasoning is it's time for him to make his own way, now being 19, but in reality, Stewart was looking for a place where he could hide himself away from the world and do horrible things to helpless children. His parents unfortunately agreed, and he moved onto the farmland in Wineville, California, now known as Mira Loma. Before he did this, though, he went up to Canada to visit his sister Winnie, and also to bring his nephew Sanford back with him. Sanford was a small, meek, 12 or 13-year-old boy who was used to being beaten for talking out of turn or just because his mother felt like it. Again, his mother was very controlling and domineering, and like her mother, would give Stewart anything and everything he wanted. So it's not clear, at least from what I read, if Winnie is equally manipulative as Stewart and just really likes him because they're one and the same, or if Stewart had her wrapped around his finger just like he had his mother wrapped around his finger as well. It's hard to tell. But anyway, their dynamic was very, very strange and borderline inappropriate, if not inappropriate. But regardless of whether or not we can, confirm or deny these rumors, all of this is to say that when Stewart showed up on her doorstep asking to take one of her young sons across the country, out of the country, to another country, illegally no less, She, of course, said yes. Now, she had 2 sons. One was a little bit younger than Sanford, and that's who Stewart originally wanted. Weirdly, she put her foot down and said no because she liked that son much more than she liked Sanford. So instead, she said, you can take Sanford. I don't care. Get him out of my fucking house. We can't afford him. You know, his dad put up a fight and was like, I don't want you to take my son. He's 13, 12, 13, something like that. And she's like, well, you don't work enough to afford to keep him. So unless you suddenly can come up with some money, this kid's going to California. Now, Sanford, meek as he was definitely not interested in going with his horrible uncle, but he also knew he had no choice. So after a day or two, away they go. The trip to California was filled with beatings for Sanford. If he spoke wrong, if he looked wrong, if he didn't speak, just because he was getting smacked over the head, punched in the head, thrown on the ground, really fucked up shit, just out of nowhere for no reason from his own uncle. But it got really bad once they got into Los Angeles. It was maybe the second night they were there, still staying at Stewart's parents' house, just, temporarily, when Sanford was raped by Stewart violently. Once they moved to the farm, this became nearly a daily occurrence. Sanford was forced to work all day on the farm, tending to the chickens, digging ditches, cleaning, harvesting and candling eggs, anything and everything the farm needed. And at night, after his work was done, he was beaten and raped by his uncle. He was also raped with objects by his uncle. And there was a lot of damage done to his body over this time as a result of this. Now, this specific situation went on for a few weeks, maybe a couple of months, until they were able to build a small shack with no electricity. So it wasn't really like a house. I think they called it a house, but it was a pretty small space. Sorry, you can hear my dogs barking in the background. Before this, they had been just sleeping in a tent, and all of this horribleness was happening basically just outdoors. They also built a barn and a few more coops for the chickens. Now, once these bigger projects were done, it seemed Stewart's attention turned to his real reason for even being on this chunk of land. He would still violently assault Sanford nearly daily, beating and raping him and seeming to get more violent each time. But after these buildings were built, he would also leave the property for a few hours at a time. Now, he started doing this after he knew that he had had Sanford so beaten down and scared that he wouldn't leave and he wouldn't tell anyone. And again, Stewart is like a master manipulator, and he's been manipulating people his entire life with pretty good success. So he knows when he can leave without being in fear of Sanford telling someone, right? So he's got a really good sense for how Sanford's going to react. Now, Sanford would be left there to read or do farm work, and after a few weeks, when Stewart came back, he brought someone with him. We still aren't sure exactly who this child was, but we do know that he was a migrant farm worker, probably around 14 or so, and that he came willingly to Stewart's farm. He was probably offered work. Sanford, unfortunately, immediately knew what was going to happen to this poor boy, but he was forbidden from being in the same room with Stewart and the boy, and had to instead hear the horrible screams, pleading, and crying that came from this boy for hours the first night that he was there. This created another kind of trauma for Sanford. Hearing the sounds he knew he himself also made while being attacked, and having to be there while his uncle raped and beat another child while not being able to do a thing about it. Now, this boy, whoever he was, remained on the farm for a few weeks, chained up in one of the coops. Sanford had to bring him food, but was not able to help him beyond that for fear of, being beaten or killed for trying to help the boy. After a few weeks of this nightly terrors Sanford himself had experienced, but now only heard from another room, finally, Stewart left with the boy, and when he came back alone. We now know that this boy was murdered and dumped by Stewart, but at the time, Sanford hoped against hope that the boy had been let go. Unfortunately, that was not the case, but, he's 12 or 13 years old. He's really just hoping for the best. From here, a pattern emerged over the next 18 months, starting in mid-1926 and going until 1928. Every few weeks, Stewart would find another boy, bring him to the property, torture and rape him, and then the boy would disappear after a few weeks. Every victim was a migrant worker, and this was unfortunately a very smart move by Stewart. Despite being as young as, 12 years old, a lot of these boys were in LA without their families. They were just there coming up from Mexico trying to get work and would rarely speak to their parents. So even if they went missing, this wouldn't be noticed for a long time. And even after they were found to be gone, this wasn't a big deal to the police. There wasn't a lot their families could do. The cops didn't really give a shit because these aren't American citizens. They're just, boys from Mexico. And back then, people don't care nowadays. Imagine what it was like back then. Sanford later said that this pattern of abuse gave him a sort of sick relief, which he of course felt extremely guilty about. He knew that any night another boy was tortured was a night off for him. And to be clear, he was still being beaten and assaulted multiple times a week, but far less than he had been when he first came to the farm and was the only boy there. In the 18 months this went on, Sanford later estimated around 20 boys had been brought to the farm in this manner, which is absolutely fucking crazy. Finally, in 1928, Stewart, who loved getting away with these crimes, decided to kick things up a notch because don't all psychopaths do that eventually, which is great because then they get caught. Stewart had previously worked at a grocery store in the area before he conned his parents into buying him a chicken farm, and while he was there, he met many families in the area, including a woman, Christine, who had a young son, Walter. If these names sound familiar, it's because they're from the beginning of this story. Christine would often send Walter to the store on his own to get her groceries. So by the age of 9, he already knew many of the people in the community, which included Stewart the grocer. And that's why on March 10th, 1928, when Stewart happened to see Walter, it didn't take much to get him to come with him back to his chicken farm by promising to take him to his, quote, ranch to ride some horses. Pretty quickly after they arrived, Walter realized there were no horses and he'd been had, but unfortunately, by that time, it was too late. Stewart threatened Walter, then tied him up and abused him horrifically. I actually read a book on this crime that was written by Sanford's son, and it turned my stomach many, many times. It's really graphic and horrible, and it all comes from Sanford's memories, which is terrifying. Now, the details of how these little boys were raped and beaten, also young and scared and in so much pain, and the way that it's described, it's just very, very difficult to digest. So we're just going to leave it there and say that this went on for weeks at least. Which is what makes the beginning of the story so frustrating, because the police could have found Walter potentially and could have saved him. But instead, they locked up his mother and tried to force her to adopt some random fucking child. Anyway, according to Sanford, who, again, also endured this trauma on nearly a daily basis, Walter was a tough kid and was able to endure what he did because he thought, as did Sanford, that he would eventually be freed. Now, again, Sanford didn't know what was happening to these boys, but his hope was that they were being let go. And I think he expected this would be the case for Walter specifically because Walter knew Stewart. So Stewart's picking a person, a victim that knew him. And to Sanford, that was crazy. And it's like the only option he has is to let him go. Because if you kill somebody you know, police are going to trace it back to you. They're going to know that you saw him. You're going to be a suspect. It's too dangerous. So his thinking was that Stewart's going to scare Walter into just doing whatever he wants and not telling anyone. And in Sanford's mind, this is possible because Sanford was scared into not telling anyone. Sanford was in brief contact with his family this whole time. He didn't go to school or have a job, but he was in touch with his family. He didn't say a word. So for him, he thought, maybe the same thing was going to happen. So he reasoned that Stewart would be too afraid of being caught to kill Walter. So instead, he would just scare the shit out of him. Now, again, it's a nice thought, but sadly, more of a pipe dream than anything. However, even knowing this poor young child will die, you may still be very surprised as to how it all went down. You see, Stewart was trying to get himself an alibi for Walter and invited his mother to his farm to look after the chickens while he and Sanford left for a day or two. He was going to leave Walter tied up in a coop and after likely kill him, but only after he could say he had been out of town when Walter was killed. Unfortunately for him, his mommy, overbearing as she was, snooped around and found Walter tied up in the chicken coop. Now you're going to think, oh, thank God, a sane person has entered the room. But alas, Stuart's behavior came from somewhere, and it was cultivated somewhere as well. And both of these places were his childhood home and his mother, Louise. Now, Louise here was extremely angry, of course, but Stuart began crying and whimpering, telling her he could never lie to her and that he just, quote, lost control. She was having none of it and immediately jumped in to cover-up mode. She insisted the poor child must be killed, and not just by Stuart. It had to be by all three of them, herself, Stuart, and Sanford, so that he couldn't go to the police. So that night, while this poor tortured little soul slept, the three of them crept into his pen, and thankfully, before he was able to wake up, bashed him over the head with the blunt end of an axe. They each took turns doing this repeatedly until the boy was dead. And it's said that Stuart continued to beat him well after he was dead, just because he's a sadistic fuck. Now, I want to pause the story for a second here and go back a couple of months in time before Walter is murdered, before he's, abducted, to talk about something that, had I talked about it before, it probably wouldn't have been as shocking that Walter had died, even though the fact that he was made to be killed by Stuart's mother is pretty fucking crazy. Now, prior to this abduction and murder, at one point, Stuart and Sanford went over to Stuart's parents' house. And Stuart said, "I have something I have to confess to you." He then goes on to tell his parents about how he had just had to murder a man in self-defense. Now, Louise and George are like, "What on earth are you talking about?" And Stuart's ready. He'd already coached Sanford in a story that he had to make up about this man attacking them. So when asked, what the hell happened, Sanford goes, "Oh, this man attacked him and he had to kill him and da-da-da-da-da." Then when his parents are like, "Well, what'd you do with the body?" He produces only the head of this poor man, as he had removed it from his body and put it in a bucket. Now, prior to going to his parents' house and claiming self-defense, he had actually brought the head home to Sanford and shocked him with it. Said, "Oh, I have something in a bucket for you." Sanford looks in the bucket. It's a severed fucking head. He then also makes Sanford carry the bucket. And before going to his parents' home, he's laughing gleefully while Sanford literally lost his lunch on the ground looking at this thing. So dude is one sick fuck. Now, his mother, of course, helped cover this up for him, and his father simply sat quietly saying nothing, though clearly deeply troubled, but also, cut down by his overbearing wife. So in a way, Stuart had laid the groundwork for something like this, and apparently it was the smart thing to do. Anyway, she made Sanford help kill this poor boy, then made him dig his grave, then dump him right there in the coop and cover him with dirt. Louise then left, but not until telling her son, "No more boys who know you." She's fucking crazy. Just a few short months later, on May 16th, 1928, 12-year-old Louis Winslow, who went by Louie, and his younger brother Nelson, who was only 10, went missing while out in their hometown of Pomona. They were on their way home from some sort of club meeting and met Stuart, who they possibly knew, along the way. They both ended up back at his farm, and we all know what happened to them. They were held for almost exactly a week and forced to write letters home to their frantic parents, telling them that they had run away but that they were fine. After a week, Stuart decided to really destroy Sanford's psyche by telling him he was going to let the boys go. Sanford even got so excited that he went and told the boys so. Then, without warning, Stuart clubbed Nelson over the head with the sharp end of an axe. He then forced Sanford to kill Louis just moments after Louis had thanked him for helping him stay alive. And he did this under the threat of killing Sanford. They were then buried next to Walter's body in a grave Sanford had also been forced to dig. Now, after these murders, and pretty shortly after, in fact, Stuart got really out of control when one day in early summer, he brought an entire family of 6 people out to his farm. His intention was to kill the mother, father, and 2 older sons, then enslave and abuse the 2 younger sons until he was tired of them as well. This family, the Dolls, had come out looking for work, which Stuart had of course promised them. At this point, Stuart believed he had fully broken Sanford and that the boy, now 14, would do whatever he wanted him to do. He had even said to him after he had helped kill Walter, "Now you're really one of the family," which is so insane a thing to say, like completely fucking crazy. Now, fortunately for this family, Stuart was wrong. And on this day, when he was told to distract the children, when Sanford was told to distract the children so Stuart could handle the parents, He said no. Stewart was furious, but there was nothing he could do. So instead he beat Sanford over the head with the blunt side of a shovel and put him under the boards of the chicken coop with a chain around his neck. Sanford spent the next few days in there and likely would have died were it not for his older sister, Jessie, showing up out of the blue to come visit him. Now, I don't think I had mentioned this previously, but Sanford and his sister Jessie were very, very close. Not in an inappropriate way like Stewart and Winnie, but in a brother and sisterly love kind of way. In the right kind of way. In fact, for the nearly 2 years Sanford had been gone, all Jessie did was save up money to come visit him, and it took her about 18 months to do so. But here she was. And I think at this point she's barely, 20, so she'd been working and saving money from the moment Sanford was made to leave home. Sanford later said her arrival is certainly what saved him from dying in that hole in the ground. He also obviously feared for his sister's life, as Stewart had killed probably, over 20 people at this point, including people he knew. And Sanford, had he not stopped him, Stewart would have killed an entire family of 6. So Jessie is not safe. But, at least in that moment, her presence had saved Sanford. Anyway, Jessie arrives, and after a lot of very weird back and forth, convinces or threatens Stewart's dad into helping them escape, after finally prying the details of what was really going on at the farm out of Sanford. Now, Sanford at first was refusing to talk to her about anything, but Jessie knew him really well, so she knew that something was very, very wrong. Finally, one night, while Stewart was asleep, she convinced Sanford to tell her what was going on, and she also saw that his underwear were filled with blood because he was always bleeding, because he was always being attacked. Now, unfortunately, even though Jessie had planned this escape, Stewart found out and forced Jessie to leave while making Sanford help him and his family sell the farm and go pack up to go back to Canada before Jessie told the police what was going on. And I think the reason he didn't kill Jessie was because too many people knew where she was. It was too obvious that he would have killed her. And he thought that even if he let her go and she told the police, they would still have a head start to get back to Canada. So they picked up the farm and left him in the dust, promising to come back, but obviously never doing so. So they take Sanford back to the chicken farm. It's always a pig farm where people die. But anyway, they take him back to the chicken farm. They have him pack everything up, and then the family leaves, leaving him on the farm in the middle of nowhere by himself. Meanwhile, his sister Jessie had in fact made it back to Canada and alerted the authorities after Sanford never came to meet her after she escaped. So Sanford had told her, I will escape as well. I'll meet you up in Seattle. But he never came. Had he come, maybe she wouldn't have told the authorities. But he never showed up. And she was so worried about him, she couldn't help but tell the authorities because she thought maybe he was dead. So they arrive at the farm about a week after Stewart and the family had fled to Canada. And Sanford was there alone, trying to survive off the little food that they had left behind. Now, pretty quickly, the police, they bring him in. They kind of find out what's going on. They start questioning him. And at first, Sanford is very, very cagey. He's afraid because he did kill these people. He was a part of it, that he's going to get in so much trouble. But even more so, he's afraid that his uncle is going to hurt him. He's afraid that somehow his uncle is going to get to him and he's going to hurt him. Now, for a change, for once, the police actually do something right. And they bring in some heavy hitters, some people who have really dealt with things like this, who have worked with children, who understand child abuse. And the main guy that comes in basically convinces Sanford to tell him what happened. And in return, Sanford is seen as a victim. He's not seen as an accomplice because obviously he's not, which is also what he was really afraid of. So eventually, Sanford gives them the whole story. He takes them out to the farm. And one thing I should tell you is that right before the family left Sanford there alone, they dug up the bones of the murdered boys and moved them to an undisclosed location. These bones have never been found. But luckily, they didn't do such a good job. And when police went to kind of re-dig up the grave sites, they found bone fragments from each of the 3 little boys. Now, as to the other kids who had been murdered and buried off-site, there's no proof of that, which is why when you look at this case, it's listed as him having 3 victims, or 4, I guess, because of the headless person. But then it's also listed, 20 plus, because even though there's not proof of it, we have, Sanford's testimony as to kind of what was going on. And it's probably very likely, unfortunately, that all of those boys were murdered somewhere off-site by Stewart. So they arrest Louise, they arrest Stewart. Sanford does, I think, get arrested, but, it's kind of more of, he becomes a witness. It's more of a formality. I think basically at the end of all of this, he was just left to go back to Canada. And he definitely did face a lot of adversity there because people didn't really understand what had happened to him. So he was, at least for a while, seen as a victim. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But going back to the trial, Stewart decided to represent himself, which is absolutely bonkers and just completely silly. But they had to let him. So, I mean, it's in the Constitution, right? So he fires his lawyers. He decides to represent himself. Now, prior to this, Louise had admitted to killing Walter. She didn't know anything about the other 2 boys, but then she admitted to killing them as well, trying to cover for her, perfect baby boy. And then after that, she went back and denied everything, I think because she was afraid of, the death penalty or whatever. So she's going back and forth and giving details that prove she knows what she's talking about, saying she killed them all, saying she only killed Walter, saying they all killed Walter, all this crazy shit. In the end, she ended up, I think, just getting life in prison. Stewart, however, attempts to represent himself. And the craziest part of this is that Sanford has to go up on the stand and be questioned by his uncle, who has been violently abusing him for the better part of 2 years and who had such a hold on him that I think Stewart was expecting to be able to manipulate Sanford on the stand and make him say whatever he wanted him to say. Now, fortunately, Sanford had been away from him long enough that he kind of got himself together. And in the end, this was one of the most disastrous questionings of a witness, probably in the history of the United States court system. Stewart did a terrible job, basically just incriminated himself entirely. And in the end, he was given the death penalty. He was 23 years old when he was hanged and died, thankfully. And it's said that the fall did not break his neck. So he actually choked to death over several minutes. They also said that before he was killed, he asked to have a bag on his head so that he couldn't see it coming, and that he was extremely scared. And I gotta tell you, I don't really give a shit. I don't believe in the death penalty, but I can't go back to 1931 or 30 or whenever this was, and I think 1930, and undo it, so I'm not going to shed a tear, Now, as for Sanford, what happened with him, he endured so much in his young life. I should also mention that when his mother found out that he had been getting violently abused by his uncle, she tried to help Stewart evade authorities. That's the kind of mother he had. So this guy just was, cursed from the beginning. And when he goes back to Canada, he's not seen in a very positive light. But he just continued to live his life. He served in the army. He was a pillar of the community over time. He was finally accepted as he just continued to be a good person. He got married and remained married for most of his life, had children, and, helped his son write this book. And he died in the 90s after living a very long and happy life, which I think is really, really important. And after being such a good person that those in the community couldn't help but accept him and later came to understand his story. So this is a really fucked up case, really disgusting. Like I said, a lot of the coverage of it that I found is very kind of high level. There's not a lot of detail. So I want to give a little bit more. If you want even more detail, there's quite a few books out there that you can read about this case. I'll link the one that I read in the sources. So if you want to read it, you can. It's kind of interesting. It reads like a fiction almost, but it's not, which kind of made it weird. It was almost like sensationalized, which was not my favorite, especially when you're dealing with such a serious subject matter. But it also kind of conveys the absurdity of the entire situation, which I think is definitely fair. Anyway, this is a really terrible fucking case. And I'm sorry to tell you all about it. I hope you guys enjoyed hearing about it. And I'll be back in the next week or so with another case of murder and malice and horrificness. And until then, stay safe.